Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain. Welcome to this presentation on slash warehouse costs, the smart savings of fractional warehousing, presented by Flex. Quick reminder, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So warehouses obviously are fixed, but businesses are dynamic. And today, supply chain agility and cost efficiency are paramount. So in this presentation, we're going to explore how embracing an asset-light or fractional warehousing model can revolutionize your logistics network. We'll delve into strategies for moving beyond traditional fixed cost warehousing to realize significant savings and enhance operational performance. With that, I want to introduce our speaker for today. Seth Fleming is Director of Product Management with Flex. He focuses on optimizing the end-to-end shipper experience, including customer onboarding and interaction. Seth's work involves the build-out of new demand generation tools and driving efficiency into internal processes. Seth came to Flex from T-Mobile, where he led the integration of T-Mobile and Sprint's operations as part of T-Mobile's 2020 acquisition of Sprint. So with that, I want to turn over the presentation to Seth Fleming. Seth, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate the introduction and super grateful for the opportunity to be here today and talking about this idea of fractional warehousing. And if you think about fractional warehousing, what it really is it is an underlying component of flexible infrastructure at large. And flexible infrastructure, as the name suggests, is just that. It's the opportunity to build out a supply chain network, a supply chain infrastructure that has a lot more flexibility than what your traditional 3P or 1P builds might offer. And if you leverage this idea of fractional warehousing, it can unlock significant cost savings. So let's talk about first, just to baseline and to set some context here, what I even mean when I say fractional warehousing. Really, there are two components. There is the space component, and then there's the time and the duration component. From a space component, we're talking about only utilizing the space that you actually need within a warehouse. So whereas a traditional 3P model, you might be required by contract to commit to say 50% or 80% or 100% of a building, with a flexible model, you're actually only utilizing the space that you truly need. Likewise, in this idea of fractionalizing time, you pay as you go. So again, in your traditional 3P contracts, oftentimes they're going to require that you sign a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year contract. When in reality, the need that you have might only be weeks or months or something less than those standard contract terms. And so breaking down time and breaking down space into these fractionalized notions, that's what we mean by fractionalization within the context of warehousing. And academically, I don't think that's a particularly hard concept to understand. But what I'm hoping that we get out of today's conversation is a better understanding of the practical applications of fractionalization and how it can be used within your supply chain network to strengthen your supply chain and building resilience at large. So first, at the highest of levels, Bob, you alluded to this, but the real reality is that the reason why flexibility matters, the reason why it is so helpful, is because all of our businesses, no matter who you are or what your company is or what industry you operate in, we all operate in dynamic environments. We're all subject to macroeconomic conditions and geopolitical conditions. There's going to be a lot more situations that might be specific to your industry. We're all subject to those things. And while that's true, while our conditions are largely dynamic, our networks are often fixed. Meaning we've invested heavily in either the build out of a 1P or a 3P network, and it's hard for those networks to adapt at the same frequency and the same cadence that the larger environment in which we operate changes. So that can lead to a couple things, right? One, it can lead to poor economics, and we talked about this, right? When you are stuck in those long-term contracts, you're stuck in those longer-term commitments, that can lead to poor economics if you're not actually utilizing those commitments to their fullest capacity because your business doesn't merit that you do so. You can counter that with this idea of transactional pricing, fractional warehouse space. Likewise, it exposes forecast inaccuracy. I've been in supply chain long enough to know that if there is one universal truth, it's that forecasts are always wrong. It's just a matter of how wrong they're going to be. When you're in a fixed environment, if your forecast is wrong by a certain multiple, you're going to be very exposed to either having way too much space or not enough space to properly execute your supply chain strategy. And again, that's where flexibility comes into play. You can build in those buffers either reactively or proactively to allow you to flex your space up or down as needed without those long-term leases. And then finally, in the build out of a traditional 1P or 3P network, oftentimes you're left with a lot of upfront expenditure, high upfront costs, excuse me, a long time to deploy those solutions, the time to identify potential operators, to make a selection, to work through the legalities and the contracting, to get that operator stood up with racking and infrastructure. There might be system deployments and system integrations. All of those things add time and cost up front in building out a 1P or 3P network. Whereas if you have a flexible network, particularly if you operate through a single flexible provider that can unlock different flexible options for you, a lot of that CapEx disappears, or it's a one-time CapEx versus a repeat CapEx every time you need new space or with a new operator. So we're going to jump in with a little bit more depth. And in doing so, we're going to talk about a couple of things. We are going to talk about, there we go. We're going to talk about fractionalization at large, and we're going to talk about it across 5 components. These first 3 we've already alluded to, that we're going to go into them with a little bit more depth, but we're going to look at transactional pricing. We're going to look at flexible terms in the lease space. We're going to look more closely at what reduced capital expenditure looks like in action. We're going to talk more about strategic inventory placement. And then we're going to finally talk about how we can use flexibility to streamline operational costs. So first, let's look a little bit more closely at pricing. And at this point, I'm actually hoping that I've said it enough that people are starting to grasp what transactional pricing is. It's this pay-as-you-go model. So when you need the space, you pay for the space. And when you don't need the space, you don't pay for the space. It's really that simple. Putting it to practice can be a little bit more difficult, but that's the simple principle behind it all. And that allows you to scale up or scale down the space you need based off fluctuations. Those fluctuations could be driven by anything, whether that's known seasonal demand patterns, whether it is you're trying to bypass or get into a tariff window, so you have more product than you were expecting. Perhaps you have an opportunistic buy, so you've got more product than you had planned on originally having. For any number of reasons, you might need more or less space than you were originally planning. And this, this visual here starts to illustrate that. So in this particular visual, you can see those gray bars represent the forecasted volume of total space expected to be needed. In this case, we're talking about pallet space. So you're looking in the range of a forecast, typically in the range of 20,000 pallets, give or take. But those gold bars represent actual pallet space required. So all of a sudden, you can see very quickly, there's a big delta between what was forecasted and what actually happened here. And one way to think of it, excuse me, is that the delta between the top of those gold bars and the top of those gray bars is all money that you didn't necessarily need to spend if you were to operate in a pure flexible model. Now, I'll be the first to admit that operating the entirety of your supply chain in a pure flexible model is typically not the right or best solution. But this does illustrate the point of how operating with flexible infrastructure does allow you to save significant costs. We're going to talk more later around how to balance fixed infrastructure with flexible infrastructure. All right, let's jump more closely into the idea of flexible terms. So again, flexible terms, this is the idea of only paying for space for the duration of time that you actually need it, as opposed to locking yourself into a multi-year, 3-year, 4-year, 5-year commitment. And when you have these flexible terms, all of a sudden you can start to either proactively or reactively scale up or scale down, say, for peak seasons. And in doing so, if you're only paying for those peak volumes when you actually have them, of course, there's a lot of costs that's unlocked because of that. So in this particular example, this heavily redacted but real example, we are looking at a national consumer packaged goods manufacturer. In this particular company, their peak happens in the summer month. So from a pallet storage perspective, they typically have inventory build up in the winter, spring, and then during those peak months, their pallet storage depletes as demand picks up. And then, of course, it starts to pick up again in preparation for the next year. And you can see here, if you were to compare the forecasted max pallets against the actual max pallets, again, there's a pretty big delta. So what this means is a couple of things. One, in comparing this particular customer of the traditional 3P alternatives that they had at their disposal, they were going to pay for space based off that forecast. And for that reason, they were looking at between, let's call it between 2 and 3 million a year in cost, or $200,000 a month. Whereas by leaning into Flex and a flexible solution, they were able to only pay for the space for the duration of time that it was actually required. And for that reason, that total annual expenditure dropped to less than $1 million a year. So you can see in this particular example how utilizing the flexible space only for the time that you needed it really allowed for significant cost savings against what other options may have been on the table for this particular shipper. All right, CapEx. I spoke a little bit to CapEx earlier. We're going to jump back into it with a little bit more depth here. And like I said earlier, when you are building out a 1P or 3P network, there's a lot of upfront costs. It takes a lot of time and effort to identify a building, to build out a building that might require a redesign. It might require new racking. It might require special handling equipment. And then there's the system considerations. You might have your own WMS. They might have a WMS. Maybe you have to buy a new WMS. Either way, it's common, it's frequent to have to either deploy a new system or integrate with systems. And all of that takes CapEx. And as a shipper, I'm sure you're left wondering or thinking like there might have been a better use for that CapEx, something that's more strategic other than just getting a warehouse stood up. And by reducing that CapEx, by leaning into a flexible solution, not only can you deploy that CapEx in other areas, it also allows you to experiment. And that's what we see here in this particular example. So here we have a home improvement retailer, and their goal was to deliver 2-day delivery nationwide. But the only fulfillment center in their existing network that could support direct-to-consumer 2-day delivery was on the East Coast. So supporting the entire country from the East Coast either became impossible or highly, highly, highly expensive. So by deploying a flexible solution, they were able to experiment with the geography that made them. Over the long term, this particular shipper actually preferred to build out a 1P network, to own and operate their own network. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what they didn't want to do was invest that CapEx in their own 1P network in a geography that proved to be less than ideal. So in this case, they utilized a flexible solution. They experimented with geographies. In this case, they tried Reno, and they determined, hey, does Reno allow us the outcomes that we were looking for? Are we able to support 2-day delivery nationwide by supplementing our East Coast node with now a flexible West Coast node? And can we do so at a cost that's reasonable? So again, by reducing this CapEx, you can experiment, you can start to optimize and figure out what the ideal network looks like for you. Even if over the long term, 1P might make more sense for you, this can be a really, really helpful step in getting there as a stepping stone towards 1P optimization. All right, flexible infrastructure also lets you get your inventory closer to where it needs to be. And as you can imagine, closer to where you need to be has a really positive impact on your transportation spend. So anybody who's been in supply chain long enough or is close to supply chain P&Ls is aware of the fact that transportation spend typically outweighs your warehouse spend by multiples. And for that reason, there can be a lot of value in leaning into flexibility on the warehousing side as a means of reducing your transportation spend. Of course, that's much harder to do if your either 1P or 3P network doesn't necessarily have the footprint that's going to allow you to lean into the geographies that are most ideal to have this impact on spend. So in this example we're looking at here, we had a retailer who was trying to figure out how they could improve placement of inventory to reduce fulfillment times from their manufacturers to their retail stores, and to do so in a way that would not only improve replenishment times, but also positively impact the spend on transportation. So what's not shown in this visual is the before. And in the before, you had these manufacturers who were each shipping direct to these retail stores. And it was just chaotic, quite frankly. Every manufacturer shipped to different retail stores on different schedules. Because the manufacturers wanted to wait for full truckloads or close to full truckloads to minimize their transportation spend, you'd often find that there was a 3 to 5 day lead time for an order between an order being placed and the delivery to that store. But what you see here is how a flexible solution allowed for consolidation and allowed for simplification of operations, and again to achieve the outcomes that they were looking for. So what they did is they deployed a flexible node between the manufacturers and the retailers. And in doing so, it allowed the manufacturers to consolidate inventory in the flexible node, and then from there, ship to the retail stores. The manufacturers could now send closer to full truckloads to the flexible node. The flexible node could then send closer to full truckloads and on a predictable schedule to these retail stores. And it increased that replenishment speed from 3 to 5 days previously down to 24 hours. Not only that, but the reason why they were experimenting here is because they were going through a period of rapid growth. And by having better inventory availability in their stores, they saw an increase in sales of 16%. So you can see across the board, from replenishment times to transportation spend to inventory availability, all of it was positively impacted by utilizing this flexible node in the middle. I want to call out here, this started off as an experiment for this particular example, for this particular shipper, but it works so well that over the long term, they've actually deployed this repeatedly in markets where they're growing as a more enduring form of solution. Okay, last and certainly not least, let's talk about the impact of flexibility and fractionalization on operational costs. So we talked about the CapEx component of building out a network, whether it be 1P or 3P. But there's also a lot of operational spend that goes into that process. There's a lot of effort that goes into generating requests for quotes, requests for proposals, evaluating the entirety of options that you might have at your disposal for different operators, making that selection, getting into the legal and the contracting process. All of that can take time. All of that requires operational spend. And speaking candidly, a lot of shippers don't necessarily have the teams or the resources available to effectively execute that procurement function, right? They make it happen, but perhaps it's not one of their core competencies. When you've got a flexible network, particularly if you're operating through a single flexible provider, then all of a sudden you can integrate with your flexible provider, and that gives you access to the entirety of their network. Through that network knowledge, the flexible provider can also leverage their procurement knowledge to help with a lot of that operator selection process and help facilitate the legal costs and then eventually the operational costs. Once that model is up and running, your flexible provider also can become that tower or that control tower view to help you manage the entirety of your network. So both in terms of warehouse selection and that process, then leading into warehouse management, there's a lot of opportunity to streamline your operational costs if you consolidate through a single flexible provider. Here in this example, it's really interesting. We had a Canadian company that was moving into the US to support a US retailer. That was their customer, was a US retailer. And it was important for them that they have access to a lot of different locations where they could replenish a large multitude of this retailer's nodes and to do so quickly with a really rapid SLA. And at one point in time, before coming to Flex, they were actually looking to get into double-digit markets, 15 plus markets. They were negotiating with 15 plus operators. And you can imagine the chaos that would come, not just with the setup of 15 operators, but then the ongoing management of 15 operators. And by utilizing Flex, they were able to get rid of all of that, utilize a single flexible operator that then helped them with the procurement and selection of the right operators to use. Flex then became that single control tower perspective to help manage the entirety of those operations. So this removed a ton of complexity and a ton of cost from the shipper, and Flex was able to take on that burden as a provider of flexible infrastructure. So we'll do a quick recap here. There's different ways in which fractionalized warehousing or flexible infrastructure can be to your benefit within your network at large. We talked about scalability and agility, right? Forecasts are always wrong. In many cases, you need to scale up or scale down uh, based off um, based off what's happening with your actuals compared to your forecast. And with the flexible infrastructure, you can do that with a lot more ease. We just talked about the operational flexibility, opening up some of your own operational resources to focus on other things by passing that burden of warehouse selection, warehouse procurement, warehouse management, passing that on to a single flexible provider. We talked about speed. We had an example earlier where a provider was able to leverage a flexible node between their manufacturers and their retailer stores as a means of reducing replenishment time into those stores. Cost effectiveness. We talked about operational spend. We talked about CapEx spend, how those things can be reduced when you utilize flexible infrastructure in the right ways. And then finally, I would argue that all of those things together are different forms of risk mitigation. We can't predict the future. We know the environments in which we operate are dynamic. And by being more flexible, by being able to either strategically react or proactively think through where flexible infrastructure makes sense, you can mitigate a lot of the risks and a lot of the unknowns that are inevitable within the world in which you operate. So let's take a little bit closer look at Flex specifically. Flex, we have network operators across the US, across Canada, more than 800 in total. And across those 800 operators, we have more than 3,000 warehouses that we work with. And those 3,000 warehouses have over 485 million square feet of space available. As you can imagine, this is bigger than any one single operator could provide by themselves because we're able to tap into the networks of multiple operators. Flex has our own in-house built, easy to use warehouse management system. By design, our WMS is intuitive rather. It's rapid, it's easy to deploy, it's easy for users to grasp and know how to use with minimal training, which is important because if you're operating flexible in a flexible nature, and you're responding to things, oftentimes speed is super important. So having a WMS that's intuitive, that's easy to use is super important as part of this all-up model. Because we have our own WMS, Flex also enables this one-to-many integration model. If you integrate your systems with just Flex, all of a sudden you have access to the entirety of that network that I spoke to a minute ago. Flex provides expert guidance. We have a great operations and logistics team. We have a great commercial team, and together they're going to do a lot of work to manage your account with the operators to take some of that burden off of your shoulders. And then finally, we've got our own proprietary network insights. Because we work with so many operators in so many different marketplaces, we have a lot of insights on pricing, on spot market rates, on trends. And sometimes the knowledge and insights we have move a little bit faster than what industry publications might be able to promote or advertise. And so in many ways, we have insights kind of cutting edge ahead of the curve, if you will, beyond what you might be able to read in your favorite industry publication. So a lot of advantages to Flex, but a lot of advantages to flexible infrastructure at large. And I'm hoping at this point, through some of these examples and these walkthroughs, you have a much better sense of how flexible infrastructure can be used as a supplementary piece in thinking through the build out of your entire supply chain infrastructure.
Seth, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. Really appreciate that. It's now we have the opportunity for the panel portion of our discussion here. I have a few questions I have the honor of asking you to kind of expand on what you told us already. So, given the current economic and geopolitical uncertainties, tariffs just being one of them, how do you anticipate the demand for fractional warehousing evolving in the coming years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to speak to tariffs specifically first because it's very relevant, very top of mind for a lot of our listeners, I would imagine. I know a lot of flex shippers have been very impacted by tariffs in different ways. Um, So when we think about tariffs, uh, to say that it is not certain would be an understatement, right? There are different dates as to when tariffs are going to go into effect. There's different rates for different countries. Sometimes a date has been announced, but then there's a holding period before it actually goes into effect. Sometimes tariffs that have been announced are then denounced. So it's really hard, candidly, to keep track of what's happening with tariffs and when those things are happening. Uh, and for that reason, we at Flex have seen shippers that are taking advantage of these windows when they open to bring as much inventory across borders when they can to minimize whatever impact tariffs might otherwise have on them. And so for that reason, um, I don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that this uncertainty is going to stabilize in the next few years. I think the tariff chaos will likely continue. Um, so for that reason alone, I would anticipate there being an ongoing demand for flexible infrastructure. But an important second part of that answer is that there's going to be more awareness of flexible infrastructure. This is a relatively new concept, at least in the case of practical applicability of flexibility in warehousing specifically. Um, Again, it's not a hard concept academically, but it is new in the sense that a lot of shippers are still trying to figure out like what this is, how it works within their model, when and where and why and how they should utilize it. And so I think the combination of, I spoke to tariffs, but really geopolitical instability at large, that could take many forms. I don't necessarily want to speculate on what form it's going to take, but it can take many forms. But as shippers at large get more educated on what this is, on how it might work and apply to their model, I think you're going to see that increase in demand as shippers are able to operate more strategically to respond to those unknowns that comes from either geopolitical or macroeconomic
Yeah,
uncertainty.
makes sense. So are there certain industries or types of products where flexible warehousing is more or less beneficial?
Yeah, I'll start in pure economic terms in answering that question, and then I'll transition into something a little bit more real or grokkable. But at large, I would say when the construct of a solution for which you are solving, for a problem that you're solving, if the construct of that solution is driven primarily by variable costs, fractionalization, flexible infrastructure probably doesn't actually make sense. However, if the cost structure of your solution is driven primarily by fixed costs, then all of a sudden flexible infrastructure makes a lot more sense. And if you think about
Mhm.
it, fractionalization helps you reduce the time and the space that you're paying for, both of which are typically fixed costs, right? Because they're tied to contracts in these traditional models. And so this is oversimplified, but high fixed cost structure in your solution means flexible infrastructure is a more likely candidate to be the workable solution. High variable cost model, if that's the focus, fixed infrastructure might make more sense. But to be a little bit more real with this answer, to take it away from the economics specifically, I would say the more consistent, the more predictable your operation, the less likely flexible infrastructure makes sense. Um, I'm not unaware of the fact that it would be silly to think that flexible infrastructure is always the solution. And if you have a highly predictable business, or at least a part of your business that's highly predictable, um, you probably should look at fixed infrastructure where you can really focus on optimizing and squeezing every fraction of a penny of cost out of that operation.
Yeah,
Adding to
well,
that, though, when we get into to different verticals and different specializations, whether or not flexible infrastructure makes sense, I think is a lot more circumstantial. Um, and I think it depends on the certain capabilities you have within your network and how different those capabilities must be to solve a certain problem. So let me give you just an example. If I'm a retailer and 90% of my product line is sortable parcel size product, it might, and let's say I have relative stability and predictability around the volumes of that product, it might make sense to leverage fixed infrastructure. But if my other 10% is this heavy, bulky product, it's a pain to deal with, it requires special handling equipment, I can't store it as easily, it really disrupts the nature of my operations. In that scenario, it might make a ton of sense to look to a flexible solution, particularly because flexible solutions give you access to so many operators that someone out there can handle these heavy, bulky products in a way that might be more optimized than what you can handle internally. Beyond that, it's going to vary a lot from vertical and industry to when it might make sense versus not. But I think the overarching takeaway here is evaluate what are the capabilities of your current infrastructure, and think about, do those capabilities align with the entirety of your product network? Which part of your product is known, expected, predictable versus what's not? And then from there, you can start to parse out decisions and understanding of where it might make sense to operate with more of a flexible focus.
Thanks. Well, I would wonder if the number of businesses out there that are marked by great predictability is shrinking all the time. But I guess there are some animals out there like that. Okay, so for companies who have actually adopted flexible warehousing, what are you seeing in terms of recurring usage, repeatability, and their ability to integrate this model as a core component of their capacity planning?
Yeah. Um, It's a little bit of a mixed bag here. And the reason why I say that is because, like I said earlier, this is still new for a lot of people, right? So you've got some people who have sort of tried it, but they're figuring out like how it might work best. But then you have people who have really leaned into it. And to be really clear, when you lean into it, that doesn't mean that you use flexible infrastructure as the entirety of your supply chain network or your supply chain solution. What that means is that you have figured out how to best get that blend of fixed infrastructure with flexible infrastructure. And what we are seeing on Flex through our shippers and through our customers is that those who have learned to use it strategically, whether that be proactively or reactively, um, we have a lot of repeat customers who use it for those purposes. So there's different examples, right? On the proactive side, we have shippers who have realized that it doesn't make sense to have a network that can accommodate your peak periods if those are only happening 2 or 3 months out of the year. So
Sure.
every year without fail, that same shipper comes back to us for that 2 to 3 month period. And the rest of the year, they can focus on that lower, more stable demand or volume component of their overall network. We have other shippers who have really taken advantage of these tariff windows when they can, and they've come to us more reactively, but they have strategically embedded in their thinking and their planning, like, hey, I've got a problem. Flexible solutions might be the answer here. Like, let's pull that inbound cord and see what our options are to flexibly solve this, as opposed to trying to shoehorn a solution into our existing 1P or 3P network that's not really well equipped to accommodate handling whatever that problem is that they're facing.
Okay, you make the great argument that actually flexible warehousing does have a lot of benefits for the user. But I'm wondering, based on your experience, what practical insights or best practices can you share with us that would help companies to actually maximize those benefits and ensure the success of flexible warehousing?
Yeah, I think benefit maximization here is going to start to tease out with more granularity and more specificity specific to your company, um, where fixed makes sense versus where flexible makes sense. And then again, using those two concepts in conjunction as a combined team. Even if the majority of your business is somewhat predictable, and Bob, you said yourself, like that's increasingly rare,
Yeah.
particularly as the demands of the world evolve and change. But even if that's true, it might very well make sense to utilize your fixed infrastructure for that component. Um, but you have to then think, should I build a network that can accommodate the entirety of my challenges that I might face at any point in time? I would argue no. I would argue optimize for the pieces that you know, that you can predict, that are reliable, and then evaluate where flexibility makes sense as a supplementary piece to your fixed network. And I think the more you start to think about it strategically, not just where it makes sense, but also how do you utilize it? What are your internal processes that you've set up to sort of pull that cord to realize, hey, we have an event or a situation or a problem that we are trying to solve for. Flexible solution might make sense. How do you pull that cord and recognize those moments as early as possible, as a means of building the most resilient supply chain that you can?
Yeah. I can't let you get away, Seth, without bringing up the topic that always comes into any discussion of supply chain today, and that is certain technology and AI specifically. So, how do advanced data and AI-driven insights specifically enhance the capabilities and the benefits of fractional warehousing?
Yeah, what's interesting is I don't know if the AI itself actually makes fractional warehousing any better, but what it does do is it puts shippers in a much better position to understand when, where, and how fractionalization and having more flexibility starts to make a lot more sense. So, I have to assume that between either AI or just ever-evolving data assessment capabilities, um, shippers are going to start to know with a lot more clarity, hey, these are my trigger points. These are my leading indicators that I might have a problem. Um, and I think AI is going to put us in a position to recognize those leading indicators a lot sooner than what we can today. And so perhaps rather than utilizing flexible infrastructure in a purely reactive manner, perhaps there might be more situations where you can utilize it proactively. In some cases, that's already possible. We talked about peak demand as kind of sort of a known thing. Um, but what if AI could help you better predict when and where inventory shortages or when and where inventory surpluses or opportunistic buys might be a possibility? They might be able to help better predict when, where, and how geopolitical instability might become a challenge that would impact your supply chain directly. And as I
Mhm.
think these AI-driven insights allow us to recognize these things sooner, all of a sudden you can still have your flexible infrastructure as a means of solving those problems, but you can deploy that solution or be ready to deploy it quicker rather than operating in a purely reactive manner.
Yeah, certainly one of the big selling points of AI is its ability to detect patterns that we may not actually see ourselves based on past history and be able to move that forward into future needs. Well, great. Thank you so much for that, Seth. At this point, in the few minutes we have remaining, I'd like to bring the audience in. I've already requested, and I continue to request that if you have any questions for Seth, please go ahead and post those in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can, time permitting. So, Seth, this question comes in and it says, for companies new to the concept of fractional warehousing, what's the very first step they should take to explore whether it's a good fit for their operation?
It's that business evaluation, right? Really ask yourself, what are the greatest risks to the continuity of my business? Those could be risks that you're thinking about from a forward-looking perspective. It could be things that have impacted you in your past. But really go deep in asking yourself, what have been the most disruptive events to my business? And I know I keep using this word disruptive, but I should be really clear that sometimes disruption can be hidden. And what I mean by that is if you are paying for fixed infrastructure, but you're hardly utilizing it to your fullest capacity, that is disruptive in the sense that you're spending a lot of money that you don't need to. So be really holistic in your thinking, but apply that holistic self-assessment to your own business and really start to tease out where and why and how those pain points present themselves, whether they be business continuity pain points, whether they be financial pain points, but start to uncover those, tease them out, and then evaluate, okay, this is a thing where hopefully if I understand flexible infrastructure a little bit better now, this might make sense for me to utilize as a solution to solving this pain point.
Yeah. I'm assuming that these shippers are going to want assurance from a provider like Flex that fractional warehousing, additional warehousing space will be available upon demand when they need it. They can't come to you and say, "I'm sorry, we're all booked up right now."
Right.
But with a network the size of yours, I guess that just doesn't really happen, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
We very rarely are we network constrained. I would say I can't think of a single situation where we've been network constrained. I'm not suggesting that we've won every deal that's come our way. That would certainly not be true. Um, but I will say that very rarely are we losing deals, if ever have we lost a deal because we don't have a network provider that could do the thing,
yeah.
whatever the thing may be.
Okay. This question says, why would a company opt to try flexible warehousing instead of relying solely on their current network? That's number one. And the second part of the question is what makes them, and I think we sort of addressed this, maybe you could elaborate on it, what makes them repeatedly choose to come back to the solution?
Yeah. I think to the first part of that question, I'll start by acknowledging that it is a reflexive instinct to utilize your current network. I mean, that's human nature, right? If you have a 3P partner that you work with, if you have a problem, the first person you're going to call is your 3P partner who
Sure.
who helps
You've
execute your
invested in
supply
that
chain. So that is
relationship
human
and
nature.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so that leads to your question of like, well, why should you even try the flexible piece? And I would argue that there are many situations where a 3P partner can in fact absorb whatever problem it is that you're dealing with. But the question is, are they most well equipped to absorb that problem in the most cost-effective way? And will that have any longer term implications for that relationship or for the nuances of that contract? Meaning, sure, they can absorb more volume, but wouldn't you know it, like your monthly minimum spend just went up, or it's going to have some implication for your contract terms, your duration, whatever it may be, right? There could always be a trade-off of if I'm going to do this for you as a shipper, I need to get this back from you on the operator side. Um, and so I think for that reason, it's worth just experimenting with flexible infrastructure. The beauty of it as well is it's inherently non-committal, right? We've talked about how you can do things for as long or short as you need to. And so I won't pretend that it's like cost free to set up flexible infrastructure, but it is very low cost in comparison to setting up your more permanent, your longer term infrastructure. And for
Yeah,
that reason, it might be worth experimenting with because of the non-committal nature. And you might find out, hey, this works great. This is a problem that I want to utilize flexible infrastructure to solve on a go-forward basis. Or you might find out like, hey, this in this case it didn't work for me. Maybe there's other cases where it would. But because it's non-committal, you have that opportunity to experiment, which we saw in the use cases I spoke to earlier.
sure. Okay. The questioner says if you could set one thing straight about fractional warehousing for this audience of shippers and potential users of this concept, this model, what would be the biggest misconception that you would address?
Yeah, there's two, but I'll pick one in respect of the question. Um, what I would have said is that again, you don't use fractional warehousing in as solo, right? Use it in tandem with fixed. But I feel like I've made that point. So I'm actually going to focus on a different piece here. And that is when you are looking to solve problems, I really would encourage people to think about the big picture from a cost perspective. And I want to play through an actual scenario.
Okay.
Let's say you have a situation where you have too much inventory that your current network can hold, and you have tasked your operations manager, your building manager to go find more space because the current building just can't do it. If that building manager is measured on inside the four wall warehouse spend, um, they might be a lot more inclined to utilize a current solution because it might look cheaper to utilize the current solution or to push product into an existing warehouse. What if in reality though, having that overflow product closer to destination could have a significant impact on transportation cost reduction. And so you really have to be thoughtful and holistic in the thinking of where and how to utilize flexible infrastructure and the impact it has on your total cost structure, not just inside the four wall cost structure or not just transportation cost structure. Look at those things together.
Hmm. Okay. Well, what a great presentation and what great questions we've had from the audience. But unfortunately, I'm the bearer of bad news in this case, and that is that we were just about out of time. We have time for one final question, Seth, and here it is. If there's one immediate action that our audience should consider taking after this webinar to significantly boost the agility of their supply chains, what would that be?
Yeah, I think it's being honest about your pain. Acknowledge that you have pain. I have never met a supply chain network or a company with a supply chain network that operates pain-free and everything is seamless all the time. There's all sorts of jokes about how, the best day in supply chain is when there's no problems to deal with. And so I
Which one
think
would
with
that
that in
be?
mind,
Yeah,
assess your company, assess your
yeah.
pain points, look forward and ask yourself, hey, what are the costs, the carrying costs that I have of having excess inventory? Or do I face stockouts on a frequent basis during peak season? And what does that cost me? Do I have long-term leases that I'm not utilizing to their full capacity? And if that forward-looking view doesn't give you the clarity that you need, look backwards. I mentioned this earlier, but look backwards over the last 12, 24 months and ask yourself what stands out in your memory as something that was painful to deal with or where I was spending money that I didn't want to spend. And I think as you start to assess this pain, whether it be a forward-looking view or a backward-looking view or a combination of the two, all of a sudden you're going to start to paint a better picture and a better understanding of your own company and which parts of your infrastructure might benefit from moving towards a more flexible model.
That's great advice. I mean, human nature is maybe to forget pain, not think about it, but you're asking them to actually drill down into it and learn something from it and helping you to adopt this model of the fractional warehousing structure. Thank you, Seth Fleming, so much for explaining to us what it's all about. Great presentation. Audience, thank you also for your participation and for your great questions. And here is an asset for all of you. This is an ebook from Flex, the Guide to Fixed and Flexible Warehousing Infrastructure. You can obtain that by taking a picture of that QR code with your phone right now, or if you don't have time in these final few seconds, don't worry about it. That will be sent to all attendees of this webinar upon the end, which has come upon us, is here now. Thanks again, Seth. Thank you, audience, and everybody. Have a great day.